The year was 1941. Europe was ablaze, and Britain had stood alone against the relentless tide of World War II for nearly 2 years. London streets still bore the scars of nightly air raids. Factories hummed tirelessly, producing weapons, planes, and supplies for a nation that refused to surrender. The Blitz had rained terror across cities, yet the British spirit endured. And across the Atlantic, American generals, initially distant observers, were beginning to see the magnitude of what Britain had endured and what it had achieved without allies to share the burden. It was in those months, in conversations recorded in private letters, in telegrams intercepted in Washington, and in first-hand accounts from envoys and liaison officers, that the United States military leadership began to grasp the depth of Britain's resilience. Generals who had studied warfare in classrooms, who had imagined what modern war might look like, were forced to confront the stark reality of an island nation standing alone. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, wrote to colleagues that the British had faced the storm with courage unmatched in modern history. The words were deliberate. Marshall, a man not prone to hyperbole, felt compelled to acknowledge a performance that defied calculation, that demanded recognition. American military observers arriving in London for the first time described scenes that seemed almost impossible. Bombed-out buildings lined streets where civilians went about their business with a stoicism that confounded expectation. Soldiers returning from North Africa and the Mediterranean theaters spoke of Britain's ability to endure without the immediate support of allies. One account preserved in the papers of Admiral Ernest King spoke of a visit to a London command centre. We expected a broken nation. Instead, we found a machine of war, disciplined, organized, unyielding, and confident. Their eyes bore the knowledge that surrender was not an option. The strategic admiration of the Americans was not merely sentimental, it was pragmatic. They realized that the endurance of Britain bought the world time, bought the United States time to prepare, and ultimately reshaped the calculus of global conflict. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later command Allied forces in Europe, noted in a letter to Marshall that the British example set a standard for perseverance. They have fought alone with ingenuity and resolve. Any man who underestimates what they have achieved under fire is blind to the lessons of World War II. In Washington, the intelligence reports trickled in. Each paragraph, each map, each intercepted communique painted a picture of a nation refusing to yield. The Americans read the operational plans, the logistics assessments, the detailed accounts of nightly air raids. But more striking than the numbers was the human factor, the unwavering morale of a population and military that understood that defeat would mean the end of their civilization as they knew it. It was a revelation. The generals, trained to calculate risk and probability, were confronted with a living example of determination exceeding expectation. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the British chief of the Imperial General Staff, met with American observers and spoke candidly about the state of the British Army. He described the shortages, the improvisations, the moments of despair that came in quiet corners. Yet in each conversation, the Americans sensed the underlying pride and defiance. One young colonel noted in his diary that every officer here carries the weight of the nation's hope, and yet they move with precision, purpose, and dignity. The courage is quiet, but it is everywhere. The shock experienced by American generals was compounded by the realization that they had underestimated Britain's capacity to resist. Before the war, many assumed that an island nation without large land armies or immediate continental allies could not survive prolonged conflict against a mechanized and aggressive enemy. Yet Britain had endured. And as the Americans watched convoys of ships, columns of tanks being transporting to ports, and the orchestration of the Royal Air Force, they saw a nation that had adapted, innovated, and thrived under pressure. Letters from American observers captured these emotions in raw form. One general wrote, "I came expecting to see exhaustion, defeat, perhaps even surrender. Instead, I find an island brimming with resilience, a society mobilized to its fullest, and a military whose spirit cannot be broken. These words, though personal, would come to influence official reports and recommendations that shaped U.S. engagement in War World II. Respect turned into admiration, admiration edged into strategic partnership, and slowly the contours of the U.S.-UK alliance began to solidify in minds that had once viewed Britain as a distant and beleaguered neighbor. The Americans also noticed the subtle signs of strain, the fatigue in the eyes of airmen, the hurried movements of naval officers, the long hours in factories producing aircraft and munitions. But what stood out was not weakness, it was endurance. Every challenge met with innovation, every setback countered with determination, every loss absorbed and transformed into renewed effort. Observers began to realize that Britain's fight was not only a testament to its own strength, but a blueprint for resilience that would inspire the Allied effort globally. Reports sent back to Washington often included both technical assessment and personal reflection. General Marshall emphasized that understanding the British experience was essential to shaping American strategy. "We are witnessing the limits of human courage and organizational skill," he wrote. "Our plans must account not only for resources and firepower, but for the indomitable will of a people who refuse to yield, even when standing alone." These reports would later guide training, planning, and coordination between American and British forces, forming a foundation for the campaigns to come in North Africa, Europe, and beyond. As the months unfolded, the Americans' first-hand observations were complemented by private correspondence between generals and political leaders. President Roosevelt, keenly aware of the situation, received daily updates from his military chiefs detailing both the operational realities and the emotional impact of Britain's endurance. Eisenhower, writing after a visit to London, remarked that the spirit of Britain was a lesson in resolve that no battlefield alone could teach. It was a subtle acknowledgement that the alliance would be forged not only by common interest, but by shared admiration for courage and tenacity. Even in the quiet moments, the Americans absorbed lessons. Walking through bombed neighborhoods, witnessing the coordination of civil defense efforts, observing British troops drilling and training despite the constant threat of attack, each moment left an impression. One colonel noted that the genius of Britain is not in what they have of men or materials, but in what they have done with what little they possess. Their fight is proof that willpower and ingenuity can alter the course of events. By the end of 1941, American generals had transformed their understanding of Britain. No longer a distant ally, Britain became a model of perseverance, a touchstone for what the United States might achieve when finally drawn fully into War World II. Respect and shock had grown into a deeper comprehension of shared destiny. The letters, reports, and private accounts all converged into a singular recognition. The resolve of a nation fighting alone for 2 years was extraordinary, and it demanded a response, a commitment to stand alongside them, to share the burden, and to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain. The first impressions of American generals had settled into a deeper understanding. Shock had become analysis, admiration had become strategy. By early 1942, as Britain continued to bear the brunt of War World II alone, American military leaders were grappling not just with the courage of their allies, but with the practical implications of Britain's survival. Reports from London, rich with details of defensive coordination, supply challenges, and the tireless rhythm of production, arrived in Washington with urgent clarity. Britain was exhausted, but unbroken. General Marshall convened a series of staff meetings to examine the implications. He instructed his officers to consider not only what Britain had endured, but what it could achieve if properly supported. "Their resistance is extraordinary," he said, "but endurance alone will not secure victory. We must assess capabilities, understand their limitations, and coordinate to amplify their efforts. The Americans cannot afford to underestimate them." His words reflected a growing awareness that Britain's fight had already shaped the strategic landscape of the conflict. The American generals understood that time was a precious commodity. Each month Britain survived alone offered a greater window for the United States to mobilize fully, to prepare forces that could tip the balance of War World II. In London, American observers witnessed more than the results of battle. They saw the character of leadership under duress. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, ever disciplined and exacting, allowed the Americans to study the intricate dance of command. Daily briefings, operational maps spread across tables, telegraphs clattering with urgent dispatches. Every detail revealed a military mind stretched to its limits, but operating with precision. One American colonel recorded in his diary, "I have seen commanders under fire, yet their calm is not mere composure. It is deliberate calculation, honed by necessity. Every decision reflects a nation's survival instinct." The letters that began circulating among generals in Washington and London revealed another layer, the human cost of prolonged struggle. American generals, accustomed to reports and statistics, were confronted by personal accounts from British soldiers and officers. They read of nights spent in shelters as bombs fell, of families torn apart yet persevering, of communities organizing to maintain the supply of food, fuel, and munitions. General Eisenhower remarked privately that these accounts demonstrate the indomitable spirit of a people who refuse to yield even when the world seems against them. There is a lesson here that no textbook can convey. Strategic admiration turned toward concrete planning. As the United States increased military aid under programs like Lend-Lease, American generals took care to observe how their support could multiply British effectiveness. Convoys crossing the Atlantic, filled with tanks, aircraft, and supplies, were coordinated meticulously with British schedules. Training programs were adapted, intelligence shared, and logistical support synchronized. Every observation by American generals emphasized that Britain's fight had not been solitary in spirit alone. They had created systems, methods, and discipline that now became models for combined operations. One striking memory recorded by General Marshall involved a visit to a British munitions factory. The assembly lines hummed with activity, women and men working with steady determination. Despite shortages, air raids, and fatigue, production continued at a pace that amazed the American observers. Their ingenuity, Marshall wrote in his report, is evident in every detail, from the adaptation of machinery to the rationing of materials. They fight with every resource they have, and they stretch each resource to its limit. We are witnessing a level of organization that redefines what persistence in War World II means. The Americans also noted that the moral strength of Britain extended into every military branch. The Royal Navy, although smaller than the fleets of continental powers, coordinated convoys across dangerous waters, defending supplies essential to Britain's survival. The Royal Air Force, still recovering from losses during the Battle of Britain, maintained vigilance, patrols, and training. On the ground, the British Army, though not engaged in major continental battles, conducted rigorous exercises, maintained discipline, and prepared to defend the homeland. Each of these actions impressed upon the Americans that Britain's resilience was systemic. It was culture, strategy, and spirit combined. Private conversations between American generals and their British counterparts revealed moments of both humility and candid appraisal. One British officer confided that the nation had been lucky to survive. Yet American generals were quick to respond that luck had little to do with it. The planning, innovation, and sheer determination were evident to anyone willing to observe. General Patton, in a brief note to Marshall, commented, "We often speak of courage, but here we see it applied in every dimension: thought, labor, and execution. The British have survived not because of chance, but because they refused to fail." These lessons carried profound implications for the emerging U.S.-UK alliance. American generals began to appreciate that Britain's experience could serve as a template for Allied coordination on a larger scale. Training programs were modeled after British methods, supply chains were synchronized to avoid duplication and waste, and intelligence sharing became more rigorous. Each visit, each report, each letter contributed to a growing understanding that success in War World II would not be won by isolated efforts, but through the meticulous fusion of strategies and the blending of determination. By mid-1942, American admiration for Britain had shifted from personal shock to structured respect. The generals no longer simply marveled at endurance, they analyzed it, extracted lessons, and applied it to their planning. Eisenhower wrote that the British example teaches us that a nation's will, its preparation, and its leadership are as decisive as any weapon. Our strategy must account for human resilience as much as for firepower. It was a recognition that would inform the Allied campaigns from North Africa to Normandy and beyond. Even amidst these reflections, American generals remained acutely aware of the stakes. Britain's survival had come at enormous cost, and they could not presume that continued endurance would be guaranteed without support. Each shipment, each coordinated training exercise, each strategic consultation represented both gratitude and pragmatism, a recognition that Britain's sacrifices must be honored through action, that admiration alone was insufficient in the face of global conflict. Through the course of these observations, a theme became increasingly clear. The Americans saw that the British fight alone was not simply a military feat. It was a statement of national identity, courage, and commitment. It shaped not only how the United States would act in War World II, but how it would view leadership, resilience, and international partnership. Generals who had once expected to arrive and evaluate minor operations instead found themselves studying the endurance of a civilization under pressure. And in doing so, they began to forge the bonds that would define Allied success. By the autumn of 1942, American generals in London had moved beyond admiration into profound respect. It was not the kind of respect born merely from observing military maneuvers or analyzing maps. It was respect forged in the crucible of human endurance. Night after night, they witnessed a city under siege, yet alive with purpose. Civilians, soldiers, and leaders alike performed their duties with a quiet determination that defied logic and challenged preconceptions. The streets of London, scarred from relentless bombing, carried a weight of history and suffering, yet also a spirit of defiance that struck the visiting Americans with lasting impact. General Eisenhower, in a private letter to General Marshall, described the experience with uncharacteristic emotion. I have walked through streets shattered by the enemy's fury. I have seen children playing among ruins, workers rebuilding as bombs fell, soldiers marching with a resolute pride that transcends ordinary courage. I cannot overstate what this teaches about the British character. There is a will here that has endured without faltering, a strength that inspires not just admiration but awe. Other generals, including Patton and Bradley, echoed similar sentiments. Diaries and journals from the period capture the mixture of shock, disbelief, and strategic contemplation that accompanied their observations. One officer wrote, "We arrived expecting to find a nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, we found a people and military trained to survive under conditions most of us would consider intolerable. Their determination is instructive. It redefines what it means to persist in War World II." These words would later appear in official evaluations and contributed to the framing of U.S. strategy in the European theater. Private letters between American generals and political leaders reveal another dimension of their realization. Observing Britain's endurance was not merely an academic exercise, it was an emotional reckoning. The Americans saw the toll of prolonged conflict on men and women alike. Fatigued soldiers, civilians working tirelessly to maintain infrastructure, and families who had endured loss yet continued to contribute to the war effort. One general noted in a letter to his wife, I have never seen a nation so tested and yet so unbroken. There is a dignity here that is humbling. We must not take their struggle lightly. It is a lesson in courage and in the cost of freedom. The Americans also became acutely aware of leadership under extreme pressure. Field Marshal Brooke and other senior British officers conducted meetings with an economy of words and precision of action that impressed their visitors. Decisions that might have taken weeks in other circumstances were made swiftly, guided by experience and necessity. It is not bravado, one American observer wrote, that drives these men. It is discipline, intelligence, and an unyielding commitment to their nation. Each choice reflects a calculation informed by survival and moral responsibility alike. American generals saw evidence of innovation in every corner of British life. Factories had adapted to shortages. Training schedules were modified to conserve energy while maintaining readiness. And civil defense initiatives had created a network of volunteers and professionals prepared for emergencies. Letters to Washington highlighted the ingenuity of Britain's efforts to sustain both morale and operational effectiveness. General Marshall emphasized that understanding these systems was critical, writing, "The British approach to endurance provides us lessons in efficiency, adaptability, and morale management. These lessons are as vital as any weapon in our arsenal." Perhaps most impactful were the moments of human connection. Observers recounted dinners with British officers, visits to bomb shelters, and encounters with families displaced by air raids. These moments revealed the personal courage behind the statistics, the human dimension of warfare that often escapes formal reports. One diary entry captured a fleeting yet poignant scene. A mother cradling her child in the cellar, while her husband coordinates air raid precautions upstairs. The determination in her eyes, the calm in the chaos. It is a lesson in fortitude that cannot be quantified. American generals began to internalize a broader truth. The resilience of Britain was both practical and symbolic. It was practical in that it maintained a functioning military, preserved vital infrastructure, and defended the island nation against invasion. It was symbolic in that it represented the persistence of civilization against aggression, an example that would guide American strategy and morale as the United States entered the full scope of War World II. In recognizing Britain's human endurance, the Americans understood that victory would rely not only on materiel and strategy, but on the courage, determination, and cohesion of people united by purpose. Strategic planning evolved alongside this emotional understanding. Joint exercises between British and American forces began to take into account not only technical capabilities, but human factors observed firsthand. Training manuals were adapted to reflect British methods. Supply chains were synchronized with the understanding of Britain's limitations and strengths, and communications were refined to mirror the effectiveness of British coordination. Each observation by American generals was transformed into actionable insight, turning admiration into tangible operational planning. Letters from the period reveal how deeply these experiences shaped American perceptions of alliance. General Eisenhower wrote, "We must ensure that when America joins the fight fully, we do so in a way that honors what Britain has endured. Their perseverance teaches us humility, patience, and the need for meticulous coordination. We cannot presume our presence alone will secure victory. We must learn from their example." These reflections illustrate a shift from distant evaluation to a personal, almost moral, imperative to support and collaborate with the British effort. By late 1942, American generals had come to view Britain not as a beleaguered ally, but as a partner whose endurance and ingenuity provided a model for the Allied strategy. The letters, diaries, and reports of the time all converged on a single recognition. Britain's fight alone for 2 years had demonstrated extraordinary human courage, operational ingenuity, and an unbreakable spirit. This understanding would shape not only immediate military planning, but the long-term cohesion and strategy of the U.S.U.K. alliance throughout War World II. In these months, the foundation of trust and mutual respect solidified. American generals who had arrived expecting to assess a fragile nation found themselves instead inspired by a society capable of extraordinary resilience. The shock, the admiration, and the deepening comprehension of Britain's human endurance informed every decision, every report, and every recommendation sent back to Washington. It became increasingly clear that the American contribution to War World II would be measured not only by material support or troop strength, but by the ability to honor, complement, and build upon the lessons learned from Britain's remarkable stand. As 1943 dawned, the lessons of Britain's endurance had been fully absorbed by American generals. What had begun as shock and admiration had transformed into strategy, alliance building, and an unshakable recognition of the British contribution to War World II. Across London, the Americans observed preparations not just for defense, but for coordinated offensive operations. The meticulous planning, the disciplined execution, and the resilient population underscored the truth they had come to understand. Britain's fight alone had bought the Allies critical time and set a standard for perseverance that would guide every future campaign. General Eisenhower, reflecting on months spent in London, wrote that the courage and ingenuity displayed here are as instructive as any textbook, more so than any theoretical exercise in Washington. Britain has fought alone, and in doing so has provided us with both an example and a foundation upon which we may build a shared strategy for victory. The words captured a profound insight. Survival and resistance were not abstract concepts. They were living lessons, embedded in every street, every office, and every soldier observed. American generals began translating these observations into concrete planning for joint operations. Supply chains were redesigned to maximize efficiency, using British experience as a blueprint. Convoys crossing the Atlantic were coordinated to synchronize with British logistics. Training programs for U.S. troops incorporated methods they had witnessed firsthand, emphasizing flexibility, discipline, and innovation under pressure. Every detail reinforced the lesson that Britain's endurance was both a strategic asset and a moral compass. The impact of these insights extended to planning major campaigns. The North African landings, the invasion of Sicily, and preparations for D-Day all reflected careful consideration of lessons learned from Britain's fight alone. General Patton remarked in a report that understanding the British methods of mobilization and perseverance allows us to anticipate challenges and coordinate more effectively. Their endurance has taught us not just how to fight, but how to think strategically in War World II. These reflections were mirrored across the American command structure, influencing operational choices, logistics, and the timing of large-scale engagements. Private correspondence between generals and political leaders emphasized the moral dimension of alliance. Respect for Britain's courage was inseparable from the understanding that American involvement carried responsibility. Letters from General Marshall stressed that our presence must honor the sacrifices already made by Britain. Every action must reflect awareness of what has been endured in the past 2 years. This is not just strategy. It is stewardship of shared destiny. The sentiment underscored that the alliance was not transactional. It was rooted in mutual respect, shared values, and recognition of extraordinary human endurance. American observers also recorded the subtle but profound impact on civilian morale and the psychological dimension of war. Londoners, having endured air raids and shortages, moved with quiet determination, their resilience forming a backdrop that informed American perception of national character. There is a dignity to their endurance, one general wrote, a courage that is measured not in battles won, but in lives continued, in work done under fire, in spirit preserved against the odds. These lessons are as important as any military manual. Such observations would guide not only battlefield decisions, but also broader approaches to alliance cohesion and leadership. By mid-1943, the US-UK alliance had reached a level of coordination unprecedented in history. American generals, shaped by months of first-hand observation, had internalized the operational methods, leadership principles, and human resilience displayed by the British. The early shock at witnessing Britain fight alone had given way to a partnership built on trust, admiration, and shared purpose. This alliance would prove decisive in campaigns from North Africa to Normandy, ultimately contributing to the liberation of Europe and the defeat of the Axis powers. The human dimension remained central to these reflections. Diaries and letters captured moments of quiet awe, observing a team of engineers repairing bombed bridges, witnessing the steadfastness of civilians maintaining essential services, or seeing airmen continue their night patrols despite fatigue and loss. One American general noted, "I have come to understand that War World II is fought not only with weapons and strategy, but with endurance, ingenuity, and spirit." Britain has provided a living example of how humanity can resist even in the darkest hours. These insights shaped not only tactical decisions, but also the ethical and moral framework within which American leaders approached the war. The legacy of these experiences extended beyond immediate operations. The respect forged during months of observation and collaboration influenced post-war planning, joint training programs, and the long-term military relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. Generals carried with them lessons that transcended maps and reports: the power of human endurance, the value of strategic patience, and the imperative of honoring Allied contributions. In every campaign that followed, the echoes of Britain's solitary fight resonated in the strategy, morale, and leadership of American forces. By the close of 1943, the narrative was clear. The American generals had witnessed a nation tested by isolation, threat, and relentless pressure, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable as a result. Britain's fight alone for 2 years had not only preserved a vital front in War World II, but had taught a generation of military leaders lessons in courage, resilience, and collaboration that would guide the Allied effort to ultimate victory. The shock, respect, admiration, and strategic integration that followed became the foundation for a partnership that would endure long after the last battle was won. In reflecting on these months, Eisenhower would later summarize, "What we observed was not merely survival, it was mastery of circumstance, determination under fire, and a spirit that refused defeat. The lessons we carried from Britain informed every decision, every operation, and every alliance we forged." The endurance of a nation alone in the early years of War World II shaped the course of history and shaped the men who would lead America's armies to victory alongside them.